The Kryvan ascendancy had erased 14 species from galactic history through methodical, bureaucratic extermination campaigns spanning 3,000 years, each one documented in clinical administrative language that reduced entire civilizations to process statistics. They had never once encountered a species that responded to genocide not with despair, but with an institution. Ambassador Threl Vosik arrived at Earth's Memorial Archive expecting a museum. He left understanding he had witnessed something considerably more dangerous to his own empire's ambitions than any fleet Earth could have assembled. The Kryvan ascendancy's approach to conquest had always followed the same efficient, unsentimental logic across 3,000 years of expansion. Resistance was catalogued, analyzed, and where necessary, eliminated at the source, not through battlefield engagement, which the ascendancy generally won without difficulty, but through the patient, thorough removal of a conquered population's capacity to remember why resistance had once mattered. Cultural records destroyed. Historical languages suppressed. Successive generations raised within an administrative framework that gradually, deliberately, erased the memory of what had existed before ascendancy rule, until resistance itself became historically unthinkable, a threat that had never truly needed defeating, because it had simply been unmade from the collective memory of the people who might have carried it forward. 14 species had disappeared from the galaxy through exactly this method, their extermination so methodical and so thoroughly obscured within subsequent generations of controlled historical narrative that most ascendancy citizens living today did not know those species had ever existed at all. Ambassador Vosik's diplomatic mandate on Earth was, ostensibly, straightforward. A routine cultural assessment mission intended to catalog humanity's historical development as part of the broader intelligence-gathering effort preceding any future ascendancy engagement with human territory. He approached the assignment with the same clinical detachment his considerable diplomatic experience had cultivated across decades of similar missions on dozens of pre-contact worlds. What he found at Earth's Memorial Archive, a modest but meticulously maintained institution housed in a converted government building in Washington, unsettled him in ways his considerable experience had never previously required him to process. "You have preserved this," he said to Dr. Miriam Katz, the archive's senior historian, standing before a wall documenting one of humanity's own historical genocides with a level of unflinching, deliberate detail that struck him as almost incomprehensible given what his own species' historical practice had taught him about how conquered or traumatized populations typically processed catastrophic loss. Every detail, every name you were able to recover. The precise mechanisms of how it happened, documented and displayed for continuous public access, rather than sealed away or gradually permitted to fade from active memory. "That's the entire point," Dr. Katz said, her tone carrying a controlled intensity that Vosik's translator implant struggled to fully categorize. "We don't preserve this because we enjoy dwelling on it, Ambassador. We preserve it because we learned the hard way across multiple genocides on our own world that forgetting isn't neutral. Forgetting isn't just sad, it's actively dangerous. Every population that's ever been targeted for extermination throughout human history has understood the same thing, that the people who wanted them erased needed forgetting to happen first, needed the world to stop actively remembering exactly how it happened and exactly who let it happen, before they could ever attempt something like it again. So we made a decision, a long time ago, collectively, across a lot of different communities that all learned this same lesson independently. We would never let that forgetting happen, not out of nostalgia, out of strategy." Vosik found himself, for the first time in a diplomatic career spanning several decades, genuinely unsettled by a cultural practice that violated nearly every assumption his own species' historical experience had led him to expect from populations that had survived catastrophic, systematic violence. "My own species' historical record," he said carefully, suggests that populations who have experienced this kind of systematic targeting generally benefit, psychologically and socially, from eventual historical distance, a gradual transition away from active, detailed remembrance toward a more generalized, less specific form of commemoration that allows subsequent generations to move forward without carrying the full, unmediated weight of catastrophic historical trauma. "I understand why your species might believe that," Dr. Katz said. "Honestly, a lot of humans believed something similar too for a long time in a lot of different contexts. Let the wound heal. Let time do its work. Don't force each new generation to carry grief that isn't technically theirs. It's not an unreasonable instinct, Ambassador. It's just wrong, and we learned that the hard way more than once in more than one part of our history." She led him deeper into the archive, past exhibits documenting not merely the mechanics of historical atrocity, but the specific, gradual process by which each instance had become possible, the incremental dehumanization, the bureaucratic normalization, the countless small moments of collective indifference that had, cumulatively, allowed catastrophic violence to occur. "Every single genocide in human history," Dr. Katz said, "followed roughly the same pattern, even across wildly different cultures, different centuries, different specific ideologies driving the violence. It never started with mass killing. It started with a population being gradually redefined as less than fully human, in the public imagination, through language, through law, through countless small cultural signals that made each subsequent act of violence feel slightly more permissible than the one before it. And every single time afterward, once the killing had finally stopped and the world was left to process what had happened, there was a strong temptation to simplify the story, to make it feel distant, historical, comfortably resolved, to let the specific mechanisms fade from active memory, because remembering them in precise, uncomfortable detail is exhausting, and grief is heavy, and most people would rather move forward than keep carrying that particular weight. And your species chose not to permit that simplification," Vosik said. "We chose, collectively, across a lot of different communities who'd survived a lot of different horrors, that forgetting the specific mechanism was exactly how it happens again," Dr. Katz said. "Not the same genocide against the same people in exactly the same way. It's never that obvious. It's always dressed up differently the next time, wearing different justifications, targeting a different population, using different language that doesn't immediately trigger the same historical alarm bells. But underneath all that surface difference, it's always the same basic mechanism: gradual dehumanization, bureaucratic normalization, collective indifference from people who told themselves it wasn't really their problem until it was too late to stop. We built institutions like this one specifically because we learned that the only real defense against that mechanism happening again is a population that recognizes it early, the moment it starts, because they've been taught, in exhaustive, uncomfortable detail, exactly what it looks like before it becomes catastrophic." Vosik spent the following weeks touring similar institutions across human territory, discovering, with mounting analytical concern, that Earth's approach to historical atrocity represented not an isolated cultural practice, but a deeply embedded, cross-cultural pattern spanning nearly every human society that had survived genocide, ethnic cleansing, or systematic persecution throughout their recorded history. He observed memorial institutions maintained with meticulous, deliberate detail across dozens of distinct human cultures, each one built around the same fundamental premise Dr. Katz had articulated: that forgetting was not neutral, that historical distance was not automatically healing, and that the specific, uncomfortable mechanisms of how atrocity became possible needed to remain actively, continuously present in a population's collective awareness. Precisely because those mechanisms would inevitably resurface, in new forms, against new populations, unless each new generation was equipped to recognize them the moment they began. This is why humanity poses a considerably more significant long-term obstacle to ascendancy expansion than our current intelligence assessment reflects. Vosick wrote, in a preliminary report that generated considerable controversy within the ascendancy's diplomatic corps upon its initial submission. Our own historical approach to conquest has always depended on a predictable pattern of gradual memory erosion, allowing conquered populations, across sufficient generations, to lose active awareness of exactly how their subjugation occurred and exactly what specific mechanisms enabled it. This approach has succeeded across 14 previous species precisely because none of them developed cultural institutions specifically designed to resist this erosion. Humanity has developed exactly such institutions, independently, across dozens of distinct cultures, each one built around the specific, deliberate refusal to allow historical atrocity to fade into comfortable, generalized memory. I do not believe conventional ascendancy conquest doctrine, which depends fundamentally on this exact erosion process, eventually succeeding across sufficient generations, will function effectively against a species that has spent its entire recorded history building institutions specifically engineered to prevent it. The report's reception within ascendancy diplomatic and military circles was, initially, deeply skeptical, particularly from commanders who considered the assessment an overly abstract cultural analysis, disconnected from concrete military or strategic reality. Fleet Marshal Kesrek Osvani, reviewing Vosick's findings during a formal strategic assessment session, pressed the ambassador directly on what he considered an insufficiently rigorous analytical framework. You are suggesting, Ambassador, that a species can be rendered strategically resistant to conquest through nothing more than the deliberate maintenance of historical memorial institutions, he said, his skepticism evident even through the formal diplomatic register ascendancy protocol required. This strikes me as considerably more abstract than the concrete military and technological assessments this council typically requires before authorizing strategic reclassification of a precontact species. I understand the skepticism, Marshal, Vosick said, and I would share it myself, had I not spent considerable time directly observing the practical function of these institutions, rather than simply cataloging their existence in the abstract. I do not believe humanity's memorial culture represents merely a sentimental or ceremonial practice. I believe it represents a functional, deliberately engineered defense mechanism, one specifically designed to interrupt the exact gradual normalization process our own conquest doctrine has always depended upon succeeding across sufficient generational distance. Every population we have successfully conquered, and ultimately, erased across 3,000 years of ascendancy expansion, shared a critical vulnerability. They lacked cultural institutions specifically dedicated to preserving active, detailed, uncomfortable memory of exactly how atrocity becomes possible, allowing our administrative erosion process to succeed gradually, generation by generation, until resistance itself became historically unthinkable. Humanity has spent their entire recorded history, independently and repeatedly, building precisely the institutional defense our conquest doctrine has never previously needed to counter. I do not believe we currently possess an effective strategic response to a population that has, quite literally, built their memorial culture around the specific historical pattern our own conquest methodology depends upon replicating. The Ascendancy War Council's extended deliberation over Vosick's assessment ultimately produced no definitive strategic consensus, a rare outcome for a body typically characterized by swift, confident decision-making regarding precontact species evaluation. The specific challenge Vosick's report identified, a population actively, deliberately engineered against the gradual historical erosion that had enabled every previous ascendancy conquest to eventually succeed, represented a strategic problem Their considerable accumulated conquest doctrine had simply never previously needed to solve. Dr. Miriam Katz, informed years later of the broader diplomatic controversy her archives practices had inadvertently generated within ascendancy strategic circles, offered a response that would eventually find its way, through diplomatic channels, into Vasik's own extended commentary on humanity's civilizational resilience. "They're not wrong to be worried about it," she said, when Vasik, in one of his final visits to the archive before his eventual reassignment, shared a carefully sanitized version of his own species' strategic concerns. "We built this place, and hundreds like it across the world, because we learned over and over again, across too many different tragedies, that the people who want to do this kind of harm always need forgetting to happen first. They need the specific details to fade. They need each new generation to feel a comfortable historical distance from exactly how it happened. So the warning signs don't register as warning signs anymore. They just register as history, safely contained in the past, disconnected from whatever's actually happening in front of them right now. We decided a long time ago that we weren't going to give anyone that gift ever again. Not the comfortable distance, not the gradual forgetting. We were going to remember every uncomfortable detail, forever, specifically so that the next time somebody tries to build the same machinery, using different language, targeting a different population, enough of us would recognize exactly what we were looking at before it became too late to stop." She looked at Vasik with an expression that carried. He would later reflect in his final report, something considerably more unsettling than simple defiance, a quiet, unshakable certainty that no external threat, however powerful, could fundamentally alter. "You want to know why humanity poses a problem for whatever your empire's conquest doctrine actually depends on," she said. "It's because we already fought this exact battle, more than once, against enemies from our own species who thought forgetting was inevitable, who thought enough time and enough distance would eventually make the memory manageable enough to stop mattering. We proved them wrong every single time. We built institutions specifically designed to make sure we'd keep proving them wrong forever, no matter how much time passed or how comfortable forgetting might eventually feel. I don't know what your empire's done to the 14 species you mentioned, Ambassador, and I understand you probably can't tell me. But I bet good money that whatever mechanism worked against them depended on exactly the kind of forgetting we've spent our entire history refusing to allow. That's not an accident. That's the whole point. We say never again, and we actually mean it every single time, specifically because we built the institutions necessary to make sure we couldn't quietly, comfortably forget why we needed to say it in the first place."